My parents told me to do 50% of all chores, so I did exactly as they asked and watched them lose their mind. I was doing dishes when my mom decided I was helping around the house too much. She came up to the countertop I'd just scrubbed clean one day and slid a contract towards me, angrily declaring, "It's time for you to stop overstepping. This states you will do exactly 50% of everything this family needs. No more, no less." My dad chimed in with a grin like he'd done something. The irony was palpable. I practically gave my life up for my siblings. I dropped out of high school at 17, just to cook and clean after the children my parents had abandoned so they could pursue a life of drugs and an open relationship. I looked at the contract, then my siblings' smug faces, and signed it with a grin. "You're right, guys. Thank you for putting me in my place." "Thank goodness," my siblings Amy and Finn said in unison. The only sign of gratitude was from 10-year-old Amelia, holding my hand beside me. The next morning, I made myself breakfast while Amy stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty stove like it might suddenly produce pancakes. "Where's breakfast?" she demanded. I pointed to the contract on the fridge. "That's more than 50% of the cooking, Amy. I'm sure Mom will help you." The look on her face was almost worth the years of thankless work. Within 3 days, the electricity got shut off for 2 hours because the paper notice was buried under pizza boxes. Finn got suspended for violent outburst when he was bullied about his hygiene, and Amy got detention for stealing a kid's lunch since our parents didn't buy any groceries. The only one I couldn't watch suffer was Amelia. I'd sneak her sandwiches and help with her homework. 2 weeks in, my parents called a family meeting. "This is insane!" Dad shouted at me. "You're destroying everything just to prove a point." Mom was crying actual tears. "This is your fault," Amy screamed at our parents. "You started this stupid contract thing." Mom's face was pure venom. "If you can't be part of this family properly, then leave. Get out." The words hung there for a second. "Okay," I said with a shrug. The shock on their faces was almost comical. I went to pack my things, and when I walked past Amelia's room to say goodbye, I could hear her crying, but she wouldn't come out. So I just left and stayed with a friend. A week later, I was stocking shelves at my night job when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's Amelia, borrowing a phone. Can we meet?" We met at McDonald's the next afternoon. It was 85 degrees out, but she was wearing a thick hoodie with the hood up. "What's going on?" I asked. She looked around nervously before pulling her hood down, and I had to physically stop myself from gasping. There were bald patches all over her head, like someone had yanked out chunks of her hair. Some spots still looked raw. She reached for the orange juice I'd bought, and that's when her sleeve rode up. Burn marks. Perfect little circles on her forearm like someone put cigarettes out on her skin. "Amelia, what happened?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. She yanked her sleeve down. "I'm the only one who can't do my chores right." Her voice was so matter-of-fact, like this was normal. "Amy and Finn don't live there anymore. Grandma took them after the thing with the school calling." She didn't elaborate on what thing meant. "It's just me now, and I have to do every chore perfectly." My brain was spinning, trying to process what I was seeing, when Amelia suddenly looked at her borrowed phone, and her face went white. "I only had 20 minutes. I have to go, I'm late." "Late for what?" I grabbed her hand gently, feeling how small it still was. Her whole body started trembling. "Please let me go. I don't want to go in the basement with Daddy again." She pulled away and ran before I could stop her. I sat there for a full minute, trying to make sense of what just happened. I couldn't call CPS. They'd take hours to respond, and my parents would make Amelia lie. Cops wouldn't do anything without immediate danger. But then I remembered Marco. We'd dealt together junior year before he went straight and started his own security company. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking. "Marco, remember when you said you owed me one? I need to cash that in. Tonight." 20 minutes later, Marco pulled up with 2 of his guys. "Your parents home?" he asked. I nodded. He looked at his guys. "This is about a kid. We clear?" They nodded without hesitation. We walked up to the front door and I knocked. Dad opened it, saw me, and his face went purple. "You have some nerve." Marco stepped forward. "Inside. Now." Dad tried to slam the door, but the bigger guy shouldered it open. They barged in, starting to rummage through. "This is a home invasion. I'm calling—" Dad started, but Marco pulled out zip ties from his pocket, just holding them casually. "You're going to tell us about the basement." Mom suddenly went pale as paper. "What basement?" "We don't—" But Marco's guy had already found it, hidden behind the utility shelf that had supposedly been too heavy to move. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Gilbert pushed the door open, and it made a loud creaking sound that echoed down the stairs. My dad started yelling about how we were breaking the law and he was going to sue everyone, but Gilbert just ignored him and started down the steps. I followed right behind him, my legs shaking so bad I almost tripped. The stairs were steep and narrow, and there was barely any light except for a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The smell hit me before I even reached the bottom, this mix of sweat and something sour that made my stomach turn. Marco was saying something to Tristan about staying upstairs with my parents, but my heart was beating so loud in my ears I could barely hear him. The basement was smaller than I remembered from when I was a kid, before they blocked it off. There was a thin mattress on the concrete floor with no sheets or blanket, just the bare striped fabric all stained and dirty. In the corner sat a plastic bucket, and I didn't want to think about what it was for. Heavy locks were installed on the inside of the door, the kind you'd use to keep someone from getting out. A metal folding chair sat in the middle of the space with an old tin can on it, and there were dark marks around the rim that looked like burn marks. Gilbert swept his flashlight around the room, and I saw storage boxes stacked against the far wall. That's when I heard it, this tiny whimpering sound coming from behind the shelf. I moved around the boxes and found Amelia curled up in the corner, her whole body pressed against the wall. When she saw me, she started shaking even harder. I dropped down on my knees in front of her, and she threw her arms around my neck, sobbing into my shoulder. Her whole body was trembling like she couldn't stop, and I could feel how small she was, how thin she'd gotten. I tried to keep my voice steady and told her it was okay, that I was here now, but my throat felt tight, and my hands were shaking too. Marco was already on his phone, and I heard him giving our address to someone, saying we needed police right away for a child in danger. His face looked like stone, all hard and angry, and he kept looking around the basement like he was taking pictures with his eyes. Upstairs, I heard my dad yelling again, louder this time, and then a crash like someone knocked something over. Gilbert handed me his flashlight and ran back up the stairs 2 at a time. I heard my dad shouting about assault, and then Gilbert's voice, low and firm, telling him the cops were coming and he needed to sit down and shut up. There was more noise, furniture scraping, and then Gilbert said something about zip ties. Amelia pressed her face harder into my shoulder and whispered that she was sorry, that she tried to do her chores right, that she didn't mean to make Daddy mad. I held her tighter and told her none of this was her fault, that she didn't do anything wrong. The police sirens started wailing outside maybe 8 minutes after Marco made the call. I heard car doors slamming and heavy footsteps coming through the house. 2 officers came down the basement stairs with big flashlights and cameras, and one of them asked if the child was injured. Amelia pulled back from me when she heard the strange voices, her eyes wide and scared. A female officer knelt down next to us and asked Amelia her name in this really gentle voice, asked if she needed a doctor. Amelia just stared at her and didn't say anything. Upstairs, my mom was screaming about how we broke into her house, how Marco and his guys assaulted them, how this was illegal. One of the officers told her to calm down, that they needed to talk to everyone separately. Another officer came down and started taking pictures of everything, the mattress, the bucket, the locks on the door, the tin can with the burn marks. He asked me to step back so he could document the scene. The female officer helped Amelia stand up and guided her toward the stairs, asking again if she was hurt anywhere. Outside, I heard an ambulance pull up, more doors slamming, more voices. The officer told me I needed to come upstairs and give a statement about what happened. I started to follow Amelia, but another officer stopped me, said I had to stay and answer questions. Marco grabbed my arm and pulled me aside for a second, keeping his voice low. He said we might be in trouble for forcing our way in, that what we did wasn't exactly legal, but the evidence down here was so bad it should shift everything to my parents pretty fast. I nodded, but my brain felt fuzzy, like I couldn't process what he was saying. Through the window, I saw them taking Amelia outside to the ambulance that was parked in the driveway, with its lights flashing red and blue across the front of the house. The female officer had her arm around Amelia's shoulders and was talking to her while a paramedic opened the back doors. I tried to go after them, but the officer interviewing me said I needed to stay, that Amelia was being taken care of, and I had to tell them exactly what happened tonight. About an hour later, a detective showed up, this older guy with tired eyes and coffee stains on his shirt. He looked annoyed when the officers explained how we got in, and he asked Marco some sharp questions about what gave us the right to break into someone's house. But then he went down to the basement, and when he came back up, his whole expression had changed. He pulled me into the kitchen and sat me down at the table, asked me to start from the beginning. I told him about the text from Amelia, about meeting her at McDonald's, about the burn marks and the bald patches and how scared she was. I explained why I didn't call CPS first, that I was afraid they'd take too long and my parents would hurt her worse or make her lie about everything. The detective wrote everything down in this little notebook, asking questions about dates and times, about how long this had been going on. Around midnight, a woman from CPS arrived with a badge and a briefcase full of papers. She talked to the detective for a few minutes, and then came over to where I was sitting. She said her name was something with a K, but I was so tired I didn't catch it. She explained that Amelia was being taken to the hospital for a full medical exam and that CPS was taking emergency custody tonight. I asked if Amelia could go to my grandmother's house, told her that Amy and Finn were already there. She wrote that down and said they'd look into it, that grandmother would need to pass a home study, but kinship placement was always the first choice. At the hospital, they had me wait in this small room with plastic chairs while they examined Amelia. A nurse came out after a while and said I could see her for a few minutes. Amelia was sitting on the exam table in a hospital gown, and there was a social worker sitting next to her. When Amelia saw me, she reached for my hand and asked if she had to go back home. I promised her she didn't, that she was safe now, that she'd never have to go back to that basement again. Her eyes filled up with tears, but she didn't cry, just held onto my hand really tight. The nurse said they'd documented all her injuries with photos, and that a doctor had examined the burn marks and the places where her hair was missing. They were being gentle with her but thorough, and the social worker stayed right there the whole time. Back in the waiting room, the detective found me again, said he had more questions. It was 2 a.m. by then, and I could barely keep my eyes open, but he wanted to know everything about the timeline. He asked about the contract, about why I left, about what happened with Amy and Finn at the school that made grandmother take them. I told him everything I could remember, about how my parents had been using drugs for years, about how they stopped taking care of us, about how I dropped out to raise my siblings. He wrote it all down, his pen moving fast across the pages. In the hallway, I saw another officer talking to Marco, and this guy looked mad. He was asking Marco what kind of security company breaks into people's houses, whether Marco understood he could be charged with criminal trespass and assault. Marco stayed calm and explained that he called 911 the second we found evidence of child abuse, that he runs a real business with insurance and licenses, that everything he did was to protect a kid in danger. The officer took down Marco's information and said the DA would decide about charges, but for now, everyone except my parents could go home. My parents were being held for questioning, and I heard one officer say something about child endangerment charges being filed in the morning. Hours later at Marco's apartment, I collapsed on his couch while he grabbed blankets from a closet. My whole body felt heavy, and my brain kept replaying the image of that basement, the mattress on concrete, the burn marks on the tin can. Marco tossed a pillow at me and sat down in the chair across from the couch. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at me seriously. He said I needed to get a lawyer right away because even though we did the right thing, we did it the wrong way. His business insurance might cover some legal costs, but I should prepare for possible trespass charges, or maybe even assault charges, because Gilbert had restrained my dad. I nodded, but the words felt far away, like he was talking about someone else's life. I pulled the blanket over myself and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come for a long time. My phone buzzing woke me up, and sunlight was streaming through Marco's windows. I grabbed my phone off the floor and saw 6 missed calls from my grandmother, all from the past hour. My stomach twisted as I called her back. She answered on the first ring and her voice was shaking, a mix of angry and scared that I'd never heard from her before. She said CPS called her at 6 a.m. about taking Amelia too, that they wanted to do another home study because now there were 3 kids instead of 2. I sat up fast and tried to explain what happened last night, about finding Amelia at McDonald's with the burns and bald patches, about the basement. Grandmother went quiet for a long minute, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. Finally, she said she'd make room, but she was 68 years old, and this was a lot to handle. Her voice cracked a little when she said it. I thanked her and promised I'd help however I could, that I'd visit and take Amelia on weekends, whatever she needed. She just sighed and said we'd figure it out. After I hung up, my phone started blowing up with texts. Amy had sent 7 messages starting around 7 that morning. The first few were panicked, asking what happened and if it was true about the basement. Then she got apologetic, saying she didn't know it had gotten that bad, that she thought Mom and Dad were just being lazy and mean, but not actually hurting anyone. The last message said she was sorry for how she treated me before I left, and that she should have listened. Finn sent 3 texts total, all short. The first asked if Amelia was okay. The second said grandmother told them what I did. The third just said thanks. I stared at the messages for a few minutes, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to respond and accept Amy's apology, but I was still so angry about everything before I left, about how they acted like I was their servant, and then got mad when I stopped. I locked my phone and shoved it in my pocket without responding to either of them. I had to call out from my stocking job, and when my manager answered, he sounded annoyed before I even said anything. I started explaining it was a family emergency, but he cut me off. He said I'd missed 3 shifts in 2 weeks, and he was running out of patience. I tried again to explain that my little sister was in the hospital, and there was a CPS investigation, but he talked over me. He said if I missed 1 more shift without proper documentation, I was fired. End of discussion. The line went dead, and I sat there staring at my phone. The panic hit hard and fast, because that job was my only income. I was barely making rent at my friend's place as it was, and now I might lose the job completely. My hands were shaking as I put the phone down on Marco's coffee table. An hour later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice introduced herself as the CPS caseworker and asked if I could come to her office that afternoon to discuss kinship placement options. She said grandmother was the first choice for Amelia, but they needed to do a home study and background checks on everyone in the house. Then her voice got more serious, and she said my parents were claiming I was lying about everything. They told CPS I broke into their house to kidnap Amelia because I was unstable and angry about being kicked out. She said she needed to hear my side of things in person. I agreed to meet her at 2 and wrote down the address she gave me. The CPS office was in a boring building downtown with fluorescent lights and worn carpet. The caseworker met me in the lobby, and she was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her handshake was firm and she smiled, but it was professional, not warm. She led me to a small office with a desk and 2 chairs and closed the door. For the next hour, she asked detailed questions about everything: why I dropped out of school, what the household was like before I left, how long my parents had been using drugs, what kind of care I provided for my siblings. I answered honestly about cooking every meal and doing all the laundry and helping with homework while my parents partied. She took notes on a yellow legal pad, and her expression stayed neutral. Then I remembered the contract and pulled out my phone. I'd taken a photo of it before I walked out that day, the one my mom made me sign about doing exactly 50% of everything. I showed her the photo and her face changed. Her mouth got tight and her eyebrows pulled together. She zoomed in on the photo and read it carefully, then looked up at me with something that might have been anger or sadness or both. The caseworker set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. She said something that made my stomach drop. There were actually 2 previous CPS reports on my family, one when I was 15 and another when I was 16. Both times someone called about neglect and dirty conditions and possible drug use. Both times the reports were closed as not enough evidence after my parents cleaned up the house and coached us on what to say to the investigators. She looked frustrated when she said it, like she was mad at the system itself. She said the system had missed this and kids fell through the cracks all the time, but that didn't make it okay. I felt sick knowing that help had been right there twice and we couldn't access it. If someone had just looked harder or asked better questions, maybe Amelia wouldn't have those burn marks now. Maybe I wouldn't have had to drop out. The caseworker must have seen something on my face because she said this wasn't my fault and I'd done the right thing by getting Amelia out. That evening, my phone rang again with another unknown number. A woman named Sabine Hunt said the caseworker gave her my information and she was a legal aid attorney. She explained that I was likely facing misdemeanor trespass charges and possibly assault charges related to Gilbert restraining my dad during the intervention. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, like she dealt with this kind of thing every day. She said she'd represent me for free because of the circumstances, but I needed to understand that even justified actions can have legal consequences. We can't just break into people's houses no matter how good our reasons are. I asked if I was going to jail, and she said probably not for a first offense with these circumstances, but I should prepare for court dates and possibly probation or community service. She wanted to meet tomorrow to go over everything in detail. The next afternoon, I met Sabine at her office, which was even smaller than the CPS place. She had stacks of files everywhere and a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest lawyer." She walked me through what to expect over the next few weeks. I might get arrested and have to go to an arraignment where I'd plead not guilty. There would be court dates and possibly a trial, though she thought we could work out a plea deal. She said the most important thing was that I follow all legal procedures from now on and let the system handle my parents. No more breaking into houses or confronting them no matter how scared I was. She looked right at me when she said it and made me promise out loud. I promised and felt the full weight of how serious this had gotten. I could actually go to jail for saving my sister. 2 days later, the detective called with an update. The school district had sent over records about Amy and Finn. Finn's suspension was for fighting after being bullied about his hygiene, and the school counselor had noted concerns about his appearance. Amy's detention was for stealing food from another student's lunch, and when the teacher asked why she said there was no food at home. The records also showed Amelia had missed 14 days of school in the past 2 months, with vague excuse notes about being sick. The detective said the pattern of neglect was becoming impossible to deny. He sounded satisfied in a grim way, like he was building a case that would actually stick this time. He said my parents' lawyer was already trying to make deals, but the DA wasn't interested in going easy on them. I thanked him and hung up, feeling something between relief and exhaustion. My grandmother's number showed up on my phone 3 days later. Her voice was steady this time, not panicked like before. She asked if I could come see Amelia under CPS supervision because the caseworker said it had to be monitored since I wasn't approved yet. I took the bus across town to her house, which sat on a street with small yards and chain-link fences. Inside, it was cluttered with old furniture and stacks of magazines, but everything looked clean. Amelia was sitting on the couch staring at nothing when I walked in. The caseworker stood in the kitchen doorway with a clipboard. Amelia's face changed completely when she saw me. She jumped up and ran over, wrapping her arms around my waist. We sat together on the couch, while the caseworker watched from her spot. Grandmother brought us sandwiches on paper plates, and I helped Amelia with some math homework she'd missed. She worked through the problems slowly, erasing a lot. Then she looked up at me and asked quietly if Mom and Dad were going to jail. I told her honestly that I didn't know what would happen, but she was safe now, and that's what mattered. The caseworker nodded from the kitchen like I'd said the right thing. On the bus ride back to my friend's place, the detective called. My parents had posted bail and were back home. My stomach dropped. He said there was an emergency protective order, so they couldn't contact any of us kids, but hearing they were out made my hands shake. 2 minutes after I hung up, Sabine texted saying she'd heard and reminding me not to engage if they tried to reach out. A week later, Sabine forwarded me a letter from my parents' lawyer. It claimed I had a history of drug use because I dealt with Marco back in the school. It said I was making false allegations because I was angry about the contract, and if I kept spreading lies, they'd sue me for defamation. My chest got tight reading it. Sabine called right after and told me this was standard intimidation tactics, and to ignore it completely. She said my parents' lawyer was desperate and throwing anything at the wall to see what stuck. The detective called again a few days later, sounding satisfied. He'd gotten a search warrant approved for my parents' house. They found the 50% contract still on the fridge. They found detailed chore charts with check marks and X's covering the past 3 months. They found a notebook where my dad had tracked every single one of Amelia's mistakes. The entries made me sick. Left dish in sink, basement 30 minutes, and talked back, basement 1 hour, cigarette reminder, and didn't fold towels right, basement 45 minutes, hair pull, page after page of it. The detective said the evidence was damning, and the DA was moving forward with serious charges. Sabine called the next morning to explain that a family court hearing was scheduled 2 weeks out. She said this was separate from any criminal charges and focused only on what was best for Amelia. The court would appoint a guardian ad litem to represent Amelia's interests, independent of what any adult wanted. I asked what that meant, and Sabine said it was someone whose only job was to figure out what would actually be good for Amelia, not what I wanted, or what my parents wanted, or even what Amelia said she wanted. I forced myself to go to my next shift at the stocking job, even though I was exhausted. My manager pulled me aside near the loading dock. He said he'd heard I got arrested, which wasn't even true yet, and he was concerned about my reliability. I pulled out the CPS caseworker's card from my wallet and explained briefly about rescuing my sister from the basement. His face changed. He looked at the card for a long minute, then told me I had one more chance, but I couldn't miss any more shifts without notice. 2 days later, my phone rang with another unknown number. The woman said her name was Prudence Carlson, and she was the guardian ad litem assigned to Amelia's case. Her voice was firm, but not mean. She explained that her job was to investigate what was really best for Amelia, which might not match what I wanted, or what my parents wanted, or even what Amelia thought she wanted. She said she needed to interview me and asked when I was available. We scheduled it for the next evening at my friend's apartment where I was still crashing. Prudence showed up exactly on time carrying a leather folder. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and interviewed me for over an hour. She asked hard questions about my drug dealing past with Marco. She asked why I dropped out of school. She asked if I had anger issues or a criminal record. She asked what my plan was for supporting myself long term. I answered everything honestly, including admitting I didn't have my life together, but I'd always protected my siblings as best I could. She took notes in her folder without showing any reaction to my answers. When she left, she just said she'd be in touch. The detective called 3 days later with an update. Amelia had done a forensic interview at a child advocacy center with a specially trained interviewer. She'd disclosed details about the basement punishments. She'd talked about the cigarette burns and showed them to the camera. She'd explained how my dad pulled her hair when she cried. The whole interview was recorded and would be used as evidence. The detective said Amelia was brave and did really well, which made me feel proud and heartbroken at the same time. 2 days later, I was scrolling through Facebook on my phone when a friend request notification popped up. The profile name was Jennifer M. with a generic flower photo, but when I clicked it, my stomach dropped. The only friend was my dad's brother who lived in another state. The profile had been created that morning. I took a screenshot immediately, then another of the profile details showing the creation date. My hands were shaking as I opened my email and sent both screenshots to Sabine with the subject line, "No contact violation." I forwarded the same email to the detective. Within 90 minutes, my phone rang with the detective's number. He told me he was documenting everything, and my parents had been contacted with a formal warning. He said the next breach of the protective order would result in immediate jail time, no exceptions. I thanked him and hung up, feeling both satisfied and anxious that my parents were still trying to reach me. Sabine called the next morning and explained she was filing a motion with the court. She said the motion argued that my actions breaking into the house were taken in good faith to protect Amelia from immediate danger. She walked me through what it meant, speaking slowly, like she knew I was scared. The motion didn't guarantee I wouldn't face consequences, but it might result in a lesser charge or community service instead of actual jail time. I told her I was grateful, and she said we'd know more in a few weeks. After we hung up, I sat on my friend's couch feeling the weight of everything pressing down. I was still scared about what might happen to me. The caseworker called 3 days later with an update about grandmother's house. She said she'd completed the home study and was approving it for temporary kinship placement. She explained that grandmother was overwhelmed, but committed to taking care of all 3 kids. CPS would provide some financial support each month and connect grandmother with services like counseling and respite care. Amy and Finn were adjusting okay to living there, and adding Amelia would make the small house crowded, but manageable. The caseworker said Amelia seemed calmer, knowing she'd be with her siblings and grandmother instead of foster care with strangers. I felt relief wash over me, knowing she was going somewhere safe, even if it wasn't with me. 2 weeks after that night at my parents' house, Sabine called with news from the DA's office. They were considering charging me and Marco with misdemeanor criminal trespass, but not assault, since Gilbert had only restrained my dad briefly and hadn't injured him. She said they were offering something called a deferred prosecution agreement. If I stayed out of trouble for a year and completed community service hours, the charge would be dismissed completely. It wouldn't show up on my record. Marco was getting the same offer. Sabine said it was a good deal considering we'd forced our way into a house and I should take it. I agreed immediately, knowing it could have been so much worse. Prudence called me a few days later and said she'd interviewed Amelia at grandmother's house. Only the caseworker had been present, no family members allowed in the room. Prudence's voice was careful when she told me that Amelia clearly loved me and felt safest with me out of everyone in the family. But then she said I wasn't in a position to be a guardian right now. I was 19 with no high school diploma, working a night job and facing criminal charges. She was recommending grandmother as the primary placement with me having liberal visitation rights once I got approved through the background check process. It stung hearing it laid out like that, but I knew she was right. I wasn't stable enough to take care of Amelia, even though I wanted to. My first court date arrived 3 weeks after the basement incident. Sabine met me outside the courthouse, and we went through security together. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights. When my case was called, I stood next to Sabine at a table, and the judge asked how I pleaded to the trespass charge. Sabine had told me to plead not guilty, so we could pursue the deferred prosecution agreement. The judge was an older man with a stern face, but he seemed to understand the context when Sabine briefly explained about rescuing my sister. My parents were sitting in the back of the courtroom for their own hearing scheduled right after mine. My mom glared at me the entire time with pure hatred in her eyes. I kept my eyes forward on the judge, refusing to look at her. After the hearing ended, Sabine and I walked out into the courthouse hallway. My parents' lawyer caught up with us near the elevators. He was a middle-aged guy in an expensive suit who smiled like he was trying to sell us something. He suggested we were all being manipulated by CPS and that we should work together as a family to fight the system. Sabine cut him off before he could finish. She said I was focused entirely on Amelia's safety and had zero interest in reconciliation with my parents. The lawyer's smile disappeared, and he looked annoyed. He turned and walked back toward the courtroom without another word. I was shaking with anger, but felt proud that I hadn't said anything or engaged with him. The preliminary hearing for my parents' criminal case happened a week later. Sabine and I sat in the back to observe. The prosecutor laid out the evidence, including photos of the basement setup, Amelia's injuries, and my dad's notebook tracking her punishments. The judge found probable cause for charges of child abuse, child endangerment, and unlawful restraint. My parents were released on bond, but with strict conditions. They couldn't have contact with any children, had to submit to random drug testing, and had to stay away from grandmother's house. The detective called me afterward and said it was a strong start, but the case would take months to fully resolve through the court system. I told him I understood and thanked him for everything he'd done. I started going to a support group for young adults the following week. The facilitator had given me the information through the caseworker. Most of the people there had aged out of foster care or left home early like me. Their stories were way worse than mine. One guy had been homeless for 6 months. A girl talked about her mom's boyfriend beating her until she ran away at 16. But it helped to sit in that circle and talk to people who understood what it was like. being responsible for yourself at 19 with no real support system, no safety net if things went wrong. The facilitator gave me a folder full of resources, including information about housing assistance programs and GED classes. I took it home and actually looked through it that night. Grandmother called me a few days later and said Amelia had her first appointment with a trauma specialist. She said it went okay, which I knew was grandmother's way of saying it was hard, but Amelia got through it. The therapist was starting with play therapy and art to help Amelia express what happened without having to talk about it directly. Grandmother said she'd explain more when I came to visit. When I got to her house that weekend, Grandmother showed me a drawing Amelia had made during therapy. It was our family drawn in crayon. Amelia had drawn herself in the middle holding my hand. Amy and Finn were on one side, and Grandmother on the other. I was there in blue crayon, smiling. My parents weren't in the picture at all. Looking at that drawing made me feel sad and hopeful at the same time. Back at my friend's apartment 3 days later, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table and cleared his throat in that way people do when they have bad news. He told me his girlfriend was moving in next month and he needed me to find my own place. I wasn't mad because he'd let me crash there for weeks without asking for rent, but my stomach dropped anyway. The panic hit hard when I started doing the math in my head. My night job paid barely enough to cover food and bus fare, let alone rent anywhere. I spent the rest of that evening on my phone scrolling through room rental listings, and everything decent was at least $500 a month. I applied to 4-day jobs that paid better than stocking shelves, including a warehouse position that started at $3 more per hour. The caseworker called me 2 days later with news that made the housing stress feel less crushing for a minute. She said my background check came back clean, and I was approved for unsupervised visits with Amelia. No more sitting in grandmother's kitchen with someone watching us. I could actually take her places and spend real time together. That Saturday, I picked Amelia up, and we went to the park near grandmother's house. The weather was nice, and we got ice cream from a truck parked by the playground. She seemed lighter somehow, like a weight had lifted off her shoulders. We sat on a bench, eating our cones, and she told me she wasn't having as many nightmares anymore. She pulled off her baseball cap to show me her hair growing back in the bald spots, little patches of new growth covering the raw areas I'd seen at McDonald's months ago. Watching her smile and talk about her friends at the school made everything I'd been through feel worth it. Sabine called me on Monday and asked me to come to her office to finalize the deferred prosecution agreement. I took the bus downtown and sat in her small office while she walked me through the terms one more time. 50 hours of community service, monthly check-ins with a probation officer, no new arrests, and I had to stay away from my parents' property completely. If I completed everything successfully in 12 months, the trespass charge would get dismissed and wouldn't show up on my record. She slid the papers across her desk, and I signed them, my hand shaking slightly. It felt fair, and I was relieved to have it settled. Sabine told me the probation office would contact me within a week to schedule my first appointment. The warehouse job called me back the next afternoon while I was stocking shelves at the night job. The manager said I got the position and could start in 2 weeks. I told him honestly about my legal situation during the interview, and he said everyone deserves a second chance. I gave my 2 weeks' notice to my current manager that same shift, expecting him to be annoyed, but he actually shook my hand and wished me luck. That surprised me more than getting hired did. Marco texted me a few days later saying his deferred prosecution came through with identical terms to mine. He seemed annoyed about the 50 hours of community service, but said it was the cost of doing the right thing. He also mentioned his security business was doing really well, and if I ever wanted legitimate security training once all this legal stuff was over, he'd hire me. I thanked him and filed that idea away as a real possibility for the future. The family court hearing for temporary custody happened on a Thursday morning, and I met Sabine outside the courthouse. We sat in the back of the courtroom while Prudence presented her report to the judge. She recommended grandmother as temporary guardian with me having regular visitation rights and the possibility of reassessment in 6 months. My parents' lawyer stood up and argued that they'd enrolled in parenting classes and a rehab program, trying to make them look reformed. The judge didn't seem swayed at all. She granted temporary custody to grandmother with a review scheduled in 3 months. My parents sat at their table looking defeated and angry. After the hearing ended, I walked out to the parking lot with Sabine and saw my parents standing by their car. My mom started crying immediately when she saw me, saying I destroyed the family and ruined everything. My dad just stood there staring at me with cold anger in his eyes, not saying a word. I kept walking toward Sabine's car without responding, but my hands were shaking by the time I got in the passenger seat. Sabine pulled out of the parking lot and told me I did the right thing by not engaging. She said their manipulation attempts would continue, but I needed to stay strong and not let them get to me. I found a room to rent the following week in a house with 2 other people for $400 a month, including utilities. It wasn't much, just a small bedroom with a closet and shared bathroom, but it was mine. I moved my few belongings in over the weekend, which only took 2 trips on the bus. Having my own space for the first time felt strange and good at the same time. I set up a corner of the room with some books and art supplies I bought at the dollar store for when Amelia came to visit. The probation officer called and scheduled my first meeting for the next Tuesday. Her office was in a building downtown, and she seemed reasonable when I met her. She explained the check-in process and community service requirements, taking notes while I answered her questions about my current living situation and job. She noted that my compliance so far had been excellent, and then mentioned something I didn't know. If I enrolled in GED classes, some of those hours could count toward my community service total. I signed up for classes starting the following month at the community center near my new place. The detective called me later that week with an update about my parents' case. Their lawyer was pushing hard for a plea deal to avoid going to trial. The DA was considering it, but only if my parents pled guilty to child endangerment and accepted significant probation terms, including no unsupervised contact with any minors. The detective said this might be the best realistic outcome since trials were unpredictable and could go either way. I told him I understood and thanked him for keeping me informed about everything. 2 days later, grandmother called while I was getting ready for work, and her voice sounded worn down in a way I hadn't heard before. She told me managing 3 kids at her age was harder than she expected, and she wasn't sleeping well because Amelia had nightmares most nights. The caseworker had already connected her with something called respite care services that could give her breaks, and there was a support group for family members taking care of kids like her. I offered to take Amelia every weekend to give grandmother some breathing room, and she accepted so fast I could hear the relief. She mentioned that Amy and Finn were actually helping more with chores and cooking now, which was something at least. The following Saturday, I took the bus to grandmother's house for dinner and found everyone sitting around the small kitchen table. Amelia smiled when she saw me and scooted over to make room on the bench. Amy looked at me across the table and said she wanted to apologize for real this time, not like before. She admitted she'd been selfish and didn't understand how bad things had gotten with our parents, and she was sorry for how she treated me before I left. Finn nodded but didn't say much, just stared at his plate and mumbled agreement. I told them I accepted the apology, but we had a long way to go before I could trust them again after everything. The rest of dinner was quiet, but not uncomfortable, and Amelia held my hand under the table. 3 days later, grandmother called again, but this time she sounded happier because the school had contacted her about Amelia's progress. They reported she was catching up with her schoolwork and making friends during lunch and recess. Her teacher knew about the home situation and was being extra supportive, checking in with her daily. Amelia was part of the school's counseling program now and had joined something called a lunch buddy system, where older kids ate with younger ones who needed friends. Hearing that she was doing better at the school lifted some of the heavy weight I'd been carrying in my chest for months. The detective called me at work the next week with news about my parents' case. Their lawyer had worked out a plea deal with the prosecutor, and my parents agreed to accept it. They would plead guilty to 2 counts of child endangerment and 1 count of unlawful restraint. The sentence was 3 years of probation with mandatory parenting classes and substance abuse treatment, plus random drug testing whenever their probation officer wanted. They weren't allowed any contact with us kids, unless the court specifically approved it first. They also had to pay back all the money for Amelia's medical bills and therapy costs. The plea hearing happened on a Tuesday morning, and I went with Sabine to watch. My parents stood up when the judge asked them to and gave short statements about taking responsibility. Mom cried and said she was sorry, but Dad's words sounded like he'd practiced them in a mirror and didn't really mean any of it. The judge accepted their guilty pleas, but warned them that if they violated probation even once, they'd go straight to jail with no second chances. I sat in the back row next to Sabine and felt a weird mix of satisfaction that they were being held responsible and sadness that it had come to this. It was accountability, but it didn't undo what happened to Amelia or erase the scars. After the plea was official, the detective called to tell me he was closing his active investigation since the case was resolved. He said I did the right thing even though the way we started was messy and could have gone wrong. The evidence we found that first night in the basement ended up being crucial to building the whole case against my parents. I thanked him for taking it seriously when I called, and he said he was just glad Amelia was safe now and getting help. The community center where I signed up for GED classes started the following week, and I showed up nervous about being behind. The instructor handed out practice tests, and I worked through the math and reading sections, surprised when most of it came back to me, despite dropping out 2 years ago. She looked over my work afterward and said I was doing really well, better than a lot of students who'd been in the school more recently. She told me I was on track to take the actual test in about 3 months if I kept this pace up. Having a goal that was about my future instead of just surviving day to day felt new and kind of motivating. The caseworker called to share an update from Amelia's therapist about her progress in treatment. The therapist reported that Amelia was making steady progress and her trauma symptoms were going down. She was sleeping better through the nights, the hair pulling had completely stopped, and she was talking more openly about her feelings in their sessions. The therapist wanted to keep seeing her weekly, for at least another 6 months, to make sure the progress stuck. I felt so proud of how hard Amelia was working to heal from everything. The 3-month review hearing came up, and I sat in the same courtroom where the temporary custody order had been issued. Prudence stood up and presented her updated report to the judge, noting that the current arrangement was working well for everyone. Grandmother was managing okay with the support services CPS provided, Amelia was doing much better, and I was keeping appropriate boundaries while still being a positive presence in her life. The judge listened to everything, and then continued the temporary custody order for another 3 months, with another review scheduled. My parents' lawyer sent a letter through the court the next week, requesting supervised visitation with Amelia. They'd completed 8 weeks of parenting classes, and wanted to start rebuilding their relationship with her. The guardian ad litem had to interview Amelia about whether she wanted to see them. Amelia told her no, she was still scared of them, and didn't want visits yet. Prudence wrote a recommendation to the court, saying the visitation request should be denied for now. The judge agreed with her and told my parents they'd have to wait longer and prove more progress before trying again. The food bank where I started my community service hours was in a converted warehouse with metal shelves stacked to the ceiling. My first shift, they put me on sorting donations, checking expiration dates, and separating canned goods from boxed items. The work was simple but steady, and I found myself focusing on making sure everything was organized right instead of thinking about all the court stuff. By my 3rd shift, the coordinator pulled me aside and mentioned I was one of the most reliable volunteers they'd had in months. She asked if I'd be willing to help with the Saturday food distribution, where we actually handed boxes to families. I agreed and spent the next few Saturdays loading cars and watching parents trying to stretch limited resources. Seeing people who were struggling worse than me made something shift in my brain. When I hit my 20th hour, the coordinator caught me before I left and asked if I wanted to keep coming even after my required hours were done. I surprised myself by saying maybe, that I'd think about it. Helping people who actually needed it felt different from all those years taking care of my siblings while my parents checked out. Marco texted me a few days later saying he'd finished his community service doing free security consultations for domestic violence shelters. He wrote that the whole thing made him rethink his business, and he wanted to focus more on helping people who were vulnerable instead of just taking whatever security contracts paid the most. We met up for coffee at a diner near his office and spent an hour joking about how we both ended up doing good things the hard way. He told me about installing better locks and security cameras at shelters and how the staff kept thanking him like he was doing something amazing when really he was just using skills he already had. I shared about the food bank and how weird it felt to be helping instead of just surviving. We both agreed that getting caught doing the right thing wrong was probably the kick we needed. Before we left, Marco mentioned his offer again about security training if I wanted a better job once my probation was done. I told him I'd keep it in mind, but I was thinking about going a different direction. The GED test day came faster than I expected. I showed up at the testing center nervous about the math section, but once I started working through the problems, most of it came back from before I dropped out. The reading and writing sections felt easier, and I finished with time to spare. 3 weeks later, the scores came back, and I'd passed everything on the first try with numbers high enough to qualify for community college. The instructor called me in after class to congratulate me and handed me a folder full of information about financial aid and part-time programs. She said with my scores, I could probably get grants to cover tuition and books. I wasn't sure if college was realistic with my work schedule and everything else going on, but having the option sitting there in front of me felt powerful. For the first time in years, I had choices about what came next, instead of just reacting to whatever crisis hit. That weekend, Amelia stayed with me at my rented room for the first time. Grandmother needed a break, and the caseworker had approved overnight visits, so I picked Amelia up Friday after school. We stopped at the grocery store and she helped me pick out ingredients for pancakes. Back at my place, we made dinner together, and she explored my small room, checking out the books and art supplies I'd set up in the corner for her. Saturday morning, we made the pancakes, and she laughed when I flipped one too hard and it stuck to the ceiling. We spent the afternoon watching movies on my laptop and playing card games I'd bought at the dollar store. That night, she did her homework at my desk while I worked on some warehouse paperwork. She slept through both nights without waking up scared, which grandmother said hadn't happened in months. Sunday afternoon, when I took her back, she hugged me tight before getting out of the car and told me she was happy. Those 3 words hit me harder than anything else that had happened in the past few months. Seeing her just be a regular kid for 2 days made all the legal trouble and stress worth it. The 6-month review hearing happened on a cold Tuesday morning. I sat in the same courtroom with Sabine, while Prudence presented her updated report to the judge. She detailed how grandmother was managing well with the support services, how Amelia was thriving in therapy and school, and how I was maintaining appropriate involvement while working on my own stability. The judge listened carefully and asked a few questions about my probation status and employment. Then he announced he was converting the temporary custody to long-term kinship guardianship for grandmother. My parents could request supervised visitation in another 6 months if they maintained full compliance with their probation terms. I was granted regular unsupervised visitation and listed as a backup emergency contact if anything happened to grandmother. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable and safe, which was more than we'd had in years. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like we'd finally reached solid ground after months of everything shifting under our feet. My probation officer called me in for a progress review the following week. She pulled up my file and went through everything point by point. I'd completed 35 of my 50 required community service hours, hadn't missed a single check-in, got my GED, and maintained stable employment and housing for 4 months straight. She leaned back in her chair and said I was doing excellent, that my case was exactly what deferred prosecution was designed for. She noted in my file that she'd be recommending successful completion when my year was up. The relief I felt hearing that was huge, knowing that if I kept doing what I was doing, the trespass charge would get dismissed and wouldn't follow me around forever, made the community service hours and monthly check-ins feel manageable. She reminded me I still had 7 months to go and couldn't mess up, but her tone was encouraging rather than threatening. Around the same time, I got word through the caseworker that my parents had completed their required parenting classes and finished 90 days of substance abuse treatment. Their probation officer reported they were testing clean at every random drug test and attending all their appointments. The court scheduled a hearing in 3 months for them to request supervised visitation with Amelia. I knew this was coming eventually, but it still made my stomach hurt thinking about it. I called grandmother, and we agreed I should tell Amelia gently before she heard it from the caseworker. The next time I picked her up, I explained that Mom and Dad were working on getting better and might ask to see her with a supervisor present. Her face went pale, and she asked if she had to see them. I promised her the judge wouldn't make her do anything she wasn't ready for, and her therapist was going to help her prepare for the possibility. She seemed relieved that she had some control over it. A few weeks later, grandmother called with good news for once. Amy had graduated high school and gotten accepted to community college with enough financial aid to cover most of her costs. Finn was doing better in the school, staying out of trouble, and even made the basketball team. Grandmother sounded tired but proud when she talked about them. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She told me she was proud of me too for getting my GED and turning my life around despite everything. Coming from her, someone who'd seen the whole mess from the outside and still stepped up to help, it meant something real. I thanked her and told her none of us would be doing better if she hadn't taken Amy and Finn in when things got bad. She brushed it off, but I could hear in her voice that she appreciated hearing it. I spent the next few days thinking about what I wanted to do with the community college option. After everything I'd been through with Amelia and seeing how the system worked, I kept coming back to the idea of studying social work. I wanted to help other kids in bad family situations, kids who might not have someone like me who'd break down doors to get them out. I filled out the application for the spring semester and wrote in the program section that I planned to study social work. The financial aid office reviewed my information and called back saying I qualified for grants that would cover tuition and a work-study position that would help with books and supplies. Having a real path forward instead of just surviving day to day felt strange. For years, my whole life had been about getting through the next crisis. Now I was making plans for months ahead, thinking about a career, imagining a future that wasn't just damage control. The detective called one last time on a Friday afternoon while I was at work. He said a neighbor had come forward with doorbell camera footage from the months before I left home. The video showed my parents having loud parties with people coming and going at all hours, and one clip showed my dad roughly dragging Amelia inside one night when she was trying to leave. The footage had been used to support the prosecution and was now part of the permanent record. He explained this meant the case was fully documented and closed, that there was no question about what had happened. He wished me well and said he hoped Amelia continued doing better. After I hung up, I sat in the warehouse break room thinking about how that footage had been there the whole time, neighbors seeing things happen and not knowing what to do. It made me wonder how many other kids were living in situations where people saw signs but didn't know how to help. That thought stuck with me and made me even more sure about the social work thing. A week later, I took Amelia to McDonald's for lunch, the same location where she'd shown me the burn marks and bald spots 4 months back. We sat in the exact same booth by the window, and she ordered a Happy Meal without any hesitation, her voice clear and excited. She spent 10 minutes telling me about her best friend at the school, who likes the same book series she does, and how they're planning to dress up as characters for Halloween. Her hair had grown back enough that you couldn't see the bald patches anymore unless you knew exactly where to look. I watched her dip chicken nuggets in sauce and talk about her reading level going up 2 grades, and something in my chest loosened. She looked like a regular 10-year-old kid worrying about normal kid things. My deferred prosecution ends in 8 months, and I've already completed 40 hours of community service. Amelia stays with grandmother and sees her therapist every week, and the reports say she's doing great. My parents are still on probation with no contact allowed, which is exactly how it should be. I've got my warehouse job, my GED certificate hanging on my wall, and community college applications submitted for spring semester. The problems aren't magically fixed, and the damage doesn't just disappear, but we're all in a better spot than we were. I'm figuring out how to set boundaries and actually ask for help, instead of doing everything alone. Some days are still rough, and I wake up anxious about money or worried about Amelia, but we're moving forward together, and that's what matters. Thanks for spending a few minutes of hope with me. Go drink water, text someone kind, and tap subscribe so we can keep building gentle wins together.